Well, good evening, everyone, or good morning or good afternoon, as it's appropriate for your particular time zone. And welcome to the continuation of the MENAWCA discussions that we've been having. We took a little bit of a hiatus, but we are jumping right back into it pre-holidays, and then we will continue into the spring with different discussions that we're lining up, hopefully for every month. It's wonderful to see some returning names on the list, and it's really fantastic to see a few new names. So if you've joined our discussions in the past, I think you know how they work. And if you're joining for the first time, welcome. We're going to start off with just a few housekeeping things. Everyone should join already muted, and I would appreciate it if you could stay muted throughout the duration of the talk, and then at the end, you can join in with any questions that you'd like to ask. Please do use the chat features that are available, and myself or any one of the other MENAWCA members will answer any questions that you have. And we're really looking forward to a great discussion tonight. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Hadi Banar. We're really excited to have him as a guest speaker tonight. He's got some really interesting work that he's doing that I'm personally, and I think all of us, really interested in hearing more about. And if you don't know about Dr. Banar, he's an assistant professor of English and the ESL program director at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. His published works appear in World English's TESOL Journal, Communication Design Quarterly, and in edited collections published by MLA, Utah State University Press, and Routledge. His scholarship focuses on L2 writing assessment and pedagogy, tutor identity and writing centers, the internationalization of writing in ESL programs, and grant writing and constructive distributed work in collaborative research teams. This evening, he'll be talking to us about a new collection of chapters that he's putting together and some of his general ideas about the interconnections between faith and politics in writing centers and writing programs. And once again, it's a pleasure to have you, Dr. Banar, and when you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ryan, for this generous intro. Can you all hear me well? Yep, great. I would like to start by thanking Ryan and thanking all MENAWCA members for giving me the opportunity to speak to my fellow scholars and practitioners in the MENA region. I've lived all my life there. I moved to the US in 2015. I worked in the United Arab Emirates for 8 years, and I have to tell you that I miss the Middle East every day. Today, I don't want to speak for the whole time. I just have, 17 minutes when I'll be talking about a few experiences I've had at different institutions, whether they were in the US or outside the US, thinking about, experiences when we have to come out about our religious faith and our religious identity, whether these conversations happen in writing center sessions, or they happen in the classrooms, or even they happen in hallways, or as we interact with the peers and colleagues outside the institution. So I'm sharing the screen with you, and let me know if you can see my slide deck. Perfect. So the title of this talk is The Politics of Faith and Secularism in Writing Centers and Writing Studies, which is the title of a new edited collection that I'm collaborating on with 4 amazing women scholars who work as writing program administrators and writing center directors. I'll talk a little bit about the call for proposals in the second part of the talk before we get into the Q&A. But mainly, I would like to walk you through some profiling moments and some coming out moments. And then, after I pitch the edited collection call for proposals, I want to offer us ample time to listen to your own probably experiences, narratives, or to ask me questions related to my own experiences, or to ask me questions related to the new project we're working on. So I will get us started by talking a little bit about my chapter in Out in the Center, Public Controversies and Private Struggles, edited by Harry Denny, Robert Monday, Liliana Nidan, Richard Silvery, and Anna Sekari. It was my first opportunity to write about religious faith and writing center work and in writing studies. And I appreciate the mentoring I've received and the process from the editors to work on this chapter, because it's very hard for us to talk about religious faith, especially when we are talking about it in academia. And because, religious faith as an identity marker has not been emphasized as other identity markers in writing centered work. And that was my opportunity to get started working on this topic. So in the chapter, for those who have not read it and those who read it, I start by framing religious identity as an additional identity marker that complicates our work as practitioners and as researchers. Then I communicate my positionality. And when I talk about my positionality, I talk about my conflicting identities as I think of religious faith and its intersections with my Palestinian refugee status and my immigrant status, my current immigrant status in the US. Afterwards, I move into mentioning different experiences I've had at 3 writing centers in Lebanon, at an all-Christian school in the United Arab Emirates, at mainly a Muslim school, and at Purdue University, a secular institution, but situated in Indiana with very little religious diversity. So to get us started, I want to talk a little bit about my positionality, just to give you some perspective about where I was when I started writing this chapter. So in the academic year of 2015-2016, I started my doctorate degree in English with a dual concentration in rhetoric composition and teaching English as a second language. And I moved to the US from the Middle East. I am Muslim. I identify as Muslim. I am Palestinian Lebanese, born in Lebanon with a Palestinian refugee status. I am a US permanent resident through family chain immigration. I am bilingual. Arabic is my first language, while English is my second. I speak and write English with an accent. My darker physical features help people classify me as either Middle Eastern or Latinx. I have other identity markers that do not align with mainstream culture. I have completed my PhD residency amid a wave of anti-Muslim rhetoric. I would attend Friday prayers on Purdue campus. I fast during Ramadan and I don't eat pork. My minority status is thus easily defined and labeled in mainstream America. I bring a diverse palette of differences into spaces I enter, thus triggering the interplay of identification and disidentification with mainstream culture and further complicating power dynamics with my interlocutors. I started writing, floating on quicksand, negotiating academe while tutoring as a Muslim during the second year of my PhD residency, directly after the 2016 US presidential elections. My narrative was relevant back then and is still sadly relevant today. On page 156 in my chapter, after I summarized Maslow's argument about the incessant marginalization and rejection of religious students' literacy practices and beliefs in writing classrooms, I wrote, the exclusion of religion, however, cannot endure amid the current rhetoric that highlights President Trump administration's stance in favor of the Muslim ban, in addition to the media's persistent narratives on religious extremism, Islamophobic incidents, and terrorist bombings of religious sites in different parts of the world. If you remember, on March 15, 2019, 49 were killed in a mass shooting at 2 mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand. And earlier, on October 27, 2018, 11 were killed in a mass shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh during the Shabbat morning services. 2 incidents, honestly, that sometimes made me hesitant and alert to attend Friday prayers on Purdue campus. In spite of my awareness of living in a relatively safe college campus, I was also thinking that New Zealand is rated as the fourth safest country in the world. So if it happened in New Zealand, it could happen, like on a college campus. The incidents I encountered that challenge my religious faith are not restricted to media news outlets, however. They happen all the time, in and outside academia, in and outside the United States, in and outside my Arab Muslim community. And here, at this point, I want to narrate a few incidents that happened with me in West Lafayette in the United Arab Emirates to help you think of these profiling moments. The first incident was when my mother visited me during my graduate studies at Purdue. We were having coffee and dessert at Cafe Literato one weekend. And on our way back to my apartment, a police car stopped me after I exited Northwestern to the bridge which connects to Lafayette where I live. I did not park by the side of the road at the beginning because I thought, why would a police officer be following me? When I had to stop and he came to my car and peeked through the window, he hesitated and then said, we're on a college campus. I thought you were drinking because you changed lanes fast, and he went silent, continuing to peek through the window at my mother, who wears a head cover. I stared at him, thinking about how my mother embodies Islam, while I do not as a man, not donning any religious symbol. Religious faith as an identity marker becomes more complex when it intersects with other identity markers, like in this particular experience, gender. Who passes and who does not is a question we sometimes forget to consider. With the police officer, I had to remain silent because I did not know what to say. I felt it was not a chaotic moment, unlike probably moments we have in the classroom or moments we have in writing center sessions when we educate people sometimes about our religious faith. But with that police officer, I felt I did not need to educate him about my religious faith, its practitioners, and the shades of practice. He still gave me a warning for reasons I am oblivious to until today. Another example was when I went to the first Christmas party at my advisor's place. Some colleagues were probably surprised that I did not eat pork, while other peers from the Middle East did. Our dietary restriction, something like it's a routine practice that sometimes we don't think about, but in this particular case can be an outing moment on occasions and at places when and where we may not feel comfortable discussing our religious faith, our own identity, and the shades of difference within the spectrum. A third example actually happened in the United Arab Emirates, and that's an interesting example. I was getting out of the praying room in the English department at University of Sharjah, where I used to teach, and my colleague who wears a head cover excitedly smiled and said, "Oh, Hadi, I did not know you pray." I answered, "Why not?" She shyly smiled and said, "You're from Lebanon and it's free. I thought you go clubbing." And she stopped. I stared at her and I said, "I actually don't go clubbing much anymore, but I can go clubbing and still pray." By clubbing, she was not referring to the actual act of dancing and listening to music. She was probably alluding to the possibility of alcohol consumption. So as you see, the coming out moment we have to entertain in different spaces and on various occasions is not always comfortable. It's always in the background, whether we are in the classroom, in the writing center, or outside. It either empowers our representation or further promotes our own marginalization, depending on our audience, depending on the rhetorical situation in general, like who we're talking to, our connection with that person, the constraints at that moment, and how we navigate that particular rhetorical situation. A fourth example actually happened at the Writing Center and at the institution where I used to work in the United Arab Emirates. when one of my students unexpectedly came out and announced, I'm quoting my student in my chapter, I'm gay and I'm on drugs. His coming out moment was not expected in the context of our setting. His coming out moment did not only affect him, but affected me as the receiver, who is his primary audience at the moment. How do I respond? Was a question that I think every writing center practitioner and sometimes every professor goes through at the spur of the moment. I'm quoting myself again here from the chapter you read. On page 166, I wrote, I did not want to scare him or push him away with any hasty reaction that might be deemed inappropriate, insensitive, or inconsiderate. I was also concerned that my liberal views might be echoed outside the vicinity of that small office and reach upper management. If that happened, the very next thing on the agenda could probably be a termination of my work contract and a one-way ticket to Beirut. I was in a fuzzy and difficult situation, but I decided to be a human and to care less about the intricacies of my work environment and the risk I was taking and care more about my student. And the last incident, 2 years ago, I encountered another closing office door incident with another Muslim student I taught professional writing at Purdue. And I could identify him as Muslim from his first name that carries major representation of an influential Muslim figure, not the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, but one of his companions, Omar. He did not come out as gay and on drugs, but when there were students waiting outside my office, he allowed himself to shut the door without taking permission to tell me and explain why he missed a deadline. The actual action of closing the door took me by surprise. It was about his aunt's passing away, and he started with, as you know, in Islam, we Muslims bury our dead on the same day or the very next day. I was silent, reflecting on why he closed the door. Wasn't he comfortable talking about his aunt's passing away in front of others? Or wasn't he comfortable talking about his Muslim faith on a secular campus situated in a state that lacks religious diversity? I mainly narrated these incidents and shared them with you, which happened inside and outside the writing center to highlight Harry Denny's argument that our writing centers do not operate in vacuum. They routinely, just like our classrooms, they do not operate in vacuum. Our students bring a lot of cultural capital. Our students bring a lot of their repertoire with them to the classroom. So these spaces routinely get disrupted by environmental exigencies and forces. Harry Denny cautions against the naivety of imagining that the outside cannot or will not intrude into our spaces. And he invites us to engage difference and face the commonplace of identity politics. I'm quoting him here from his book, Facing the Center Toward an Identity Politics of One-to-One Mentoring, published by Utah State University Press. So the central question becomes, how can we transform writing center and writing studies pedagogy and education to enable writing center and writing studies professionals agency in difficult moments with concentrated dialogic impasses involving faith or lack thereof? This is my segue to pitch an edited collection, The Politics of Faith and Secularism in Writing Centers and Writing Studies. I'm collaborating on with my co-editors, Dr. Andrea Eftamio, Dr. Liliana Nedan, Dr. Anna Sekari, and Dr. Lisa Wright. My opportunity to work with both Anna and Liliana in my chapter gave me the access to continue this work with them because they focus on religious faith and writing centers and writing studies. This edited collection, I'm quoting ourselves from the call for proposals, acknowledges that to discuss faith and secularism is to discuss conflict within intersectional identity work, because it's not, we cannot think of religious faith on its own. Like through the examples we saw here, we saw the intersections of religious faith with gender, with embodiment, the intersections of religious faith with like sexual orientation, the intersections of religious faith with, our status with respect to the multiple identities and roles we play, whether we are at the institution or outside the institution. It's also to acknowledge difficulties in coalition building and how religion and faith intersect with and complicate such work, and to embrace discomfort that is always inevitable in such situations. We expect prospective contributors to submit 250 to 300 word proposals for book chapters that address the politics of faith and secularism in writing centers and programs, proposals that acknowledge that the act of writing cannot be reduced to the mechanical process of composing. When writers routinely respond to political, social, cultural, socio-religious, and socio-economic exigencies. As editors, we wish to see essays that discuss the complexity of faith, identity, and social justice work, as we believe that faith, like all aspects of identity, intersects and complicates our discussions. And to sidestep discussions of faith might hinder the type of inclusive work we are trying to do. And I remember, like, when I think about identity and writing studies or identity and writing centers, I always go back to my time in the UAE when I was teaching English for academic purposes and English for specific purposes. And I always reflect upon whether there are opportunities to do this work there or not. And definitely there are opportunities as we think of curricula, as we think of the materials we bring to the classroom, as we think of how we create zones in our spaces that allow students to discuss their thoughts about religious faith and other identity markers that I think, always intersect and intervene during their composing processes. Also from the call for proposals, I have, like the key questions, the key guiding questions. How do we engage religious faith within our writing centers and programs and embrace the diversity that exists within the religious spectrum? In what ways does faith complicate and/or enrich our conversations on race, on gender and sexuality, on disability justice, on social justice work more broadly? What does discourse on faith and secularism look like at your writing center, whether this writing center or classroom is in the US or outside the US? And how might such discourse also do the work of writing pedagogy and writing center pedagogy? How do conversations about faith start in our writing centers and classrooms? Who and what initiates them? How do we respond to them ethically and effectively? How do we engage such conversations to become part of a dialogue rather than engross a conflict? How do tutors and student writers of different faith or who are secular or atheist feel about and operate within the secular and religious institutions of which they are a part? How do we create opportunities for tutors and students to bring aspects of their religious or secularist lives to writing center tutorials and writing classrooms to promote visibility, representation, and dialogue without causing harm or insult to others? How have you revealed or concealed your faith or secularism in a writing center session or in a writing classroom discussion? What types of institutional and/or personal forces, concerns, issues had to create this moment? And finally, how have conversations about faith caused discomfort in the writing center and the writing classroom? In what ways were these moments silencing, productive, or empowering? In what ways do conversations about faith and religious identities help us learn with and from difference? How have you prepared yourself to have informed conversations on faith as it exists on a larger spectrum of identity work? Because for a long time, we thought that we cannot talk about faith because it's personal, because it's political. However, these conversations inevitably happen and invade our classrooms and writing center spaces. How do faith and religion intersect and possibly interfere with our anti-racist missions and our social justice missions in our writing centers and programs? How can we integrate conversations about faith into our social justice work and missions? And finally, I'm sharing the timeline. I think Ryan promoted this call for proposals on the MENAWCA listserv, and I'm glad during the Q&A to attach the call for proposals in the chat. The deadline is a week from today for proposals. It's on November 30, 2021. We notify authors of accepted chapters on January 7, 2022. We need the full chapters due on June 24th. We return editorial feedback to authors with some chapters circulated in different sections on August 24th. And we expect a full manuscript completed with submission to press on October 3. And while we do not have an advanced contract, but Utah State University Press is very interested in this edited collection, and we've started conversations and planning with them already. And with that, I would like to stop talking and move to the Q&A. Feel free to ask me either questions on the chapter content or questions on even the methodology, why narrative inquiry, why autoethnography is in writing-centered work, or maybe, you know, like thinking through writing-centered tutorial strategies when we encounter, or when we have climaxes in sessions, and when we encounter this impasse between the tutor and the student, or even if you have any questions on the edited collection, I'm glad to respond to them. If you have your own personal experiences that you would like to share with us, I would also be glad to listen to them. And thank you so much for bearing with me through the talk.
Thank you so much, Hadi. Thank you. That was wonderful. I'm wondering if I can just start with a quick question, and I know there are others in the chat, but could you speak a little bit more about maybe the training that the staff goes through to be prepared to have these discussions, or if they don't go through any particular training, how they manage to navigate those particular discussions? Because I'm thinking about in our writing center, I know for a fact a number of issues come up in sessions with particularly peer tutors, and a lot of it is extremely sensitive that happens. And I just hear rumors of it. I don't, you know, it's never firsthand kind of experience. And they seem quite hesitant to want to talk to me about what's being discussed in those sessions. So I don't know if you have any advice, or you can walk us through kind of some of those strategies.
Thank you, Ryan. That's a very good question, because these are the same experiences we face in the US. Like for a long time during my work at Purdue's Writing Center, we've invested in listening sessions during meetings with tutors. So tutors would bring, you know, like narratives from the different Writing Center tutorials. And for a long time, we've been just listening, analyzing, you know, like the climax in sessions, analyzing the conflicts that could happen, whether these conflicts relate to identity or relate to the pedagogy or relate to even, you know, like the methodology of running a session. But with time, we realized that listening is just venting. Like, we're just venting about these experiences, but like we also feel an ethical responsibility to respond to these experiences. So at that time, what we came up with, I was working with Harry, Denny, and the administrators. We came up with a conflict resolution tutorial that I can share with you later on. This conflict resolution tutorial basically focuses on types of conflicts that can happen in a tutoring session. And what we did with that, we tried to connect it to the concept of intercultural competence as a construct, and thinking, you know, like what's the definition of intercultural competence? How do we operationalize it? And when we think of difference, what does difference encompass? What is the umbrella of differences that we deal with? In spite of where we are, you know, like at what institution, with what audience, because climaxes happen when we least expect them. A climax can happen because, like, for example, I did not expect that a student at University of Sharjah would come out about his sexuality to me. Like when I'm thinking of the rhetorical situation, that's a situation when I'm kind of oblivious to how to deal with it. So what we did in the training, we relied on videos from certain sessions that we were compiling for the purpose of training. We also relied on like, for example, one of the textbooks, the Writing Center project, we relied on certain, transcripts of sessions that mark certain conflicts. And this professional development series took time because collaboratively with tutors, we would watch the video or we would read the script and we would identify where the climax happened, who intervened in the climax, who prepared for building climax. And then we classified the type of conflict that is represented in that particular session. And collaboratively, we started brainstorming strategies to respond to these different conflicts that usually relate to different identity markers. And some of these conflicts, we noticed that they are brought to the tutoring session. They happen even before. Sometimes with a conflict with the professor and it's brought to us, so the student come to the center with this heavy baggage, or sometimes even with the staff member scheduling the appointment, like probably some kind of conflict took place and then they are bringing their emotional labor into the session. And when we thought of these strategies, we made sure to realize that these strategies are not a toolkit that you can transfer as they are to every session. Like, they're not pre-packaged, but they are a set of strategies that you can choose from. And you still have to critically think and critically evaluate as a tutor how to respond when a new conflict happens in a session, because even if it looks like these other conflicts, there's always the element of surprise that we are dealing with. And that's the tough and challenging part.
It's really fascinating. I can't wait for the book to come out. And I see Paula's in here. It reminds me so much of what Paula's doing with the trauma in the Writing Center and how students are dealing with various levels of trauma. And it doesn't have to be trauma, but just very interesting overlaps. Thank you very much. Maimouna, you had a question earlier. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes, thank you. First of all, Ahlan Hadi, it's a pleasure to hear from you today. I was just intrigued by your choice, you and your collaborators, of the phrase coming out when it comes to religious expression. So I was wondering if you had some kind of justification or a reason for choosing that phrase. I understand now from some of the scenarios you shared with us how it could be a coming out moment, but I was just interested in the thought process that went into selecting that phrase.
Ahlan fiki, Maimouna. Thank you so much for this question. And actually, Maimouna, this is a phrase that I learned when I moved to the US, because in Sharjah and Lebanon, it was never a coming out moment for me, because I was in a context with an audience who are very familiar of my repertoire and very familiar of, or they can even guess, in Lebanon, a country that is 50%, that has 50% practitioners of Islam and 50% practitioners of Christianity. They can identify based on where I live, my family name, my first name, what religious faith I practice. But in the US, especially when I moved to Indiana after the shift from Sharjah, I noticed that I am, even when Purdue is a secular institution, even when the cultural centers at Purdue promote diversity and they promote openness and they promote freedom, it was always very difficult for me. Like, I'm proud of my identity and I'm proud of my religious identity, but it was always very difficult for me to come out as a Muslim, especially in 2016 with, like, a wave of anti-Muslim rhetoric. And it also it was also happening by colleagues and peers from different parts of the world who were asking me a lot about ISIS, and it always made me feel uncomfortable, especially, you know, like in public settings, whether in a computer lab or even at a party with our colleagues, because, you know, like I always thought that as graduate students, like we do have the critical evaluation skills to, you know, demarcate between extremism and religious faith. But you find out, or you get surprised, that a lot of people are not aware, and this kind of conversation is part of our repertoire in the Middle East, because I think we are always misrepresented, or we're usually misrepresented in the Western world and media outlets. So we are prepared, you know, like to think about these issues. But for many people, like for my colleagues from South Korea, from China, it was all like they meant well, but they were always curious to ask these questions. And for some reason, I always felt I was targeted. I always felt, even when it was not their intention, I am being attacked. And I have, even when I wanted to relax in a social setting, like I have to give a lecture on, you know, like who I am, my religious identity, the shades of practice, the practitioners. And we sometimes do not want to entertain these conversations. And sometimes in a writing center session, we don't have time to, you know, like entertain these conversations, especially when there is an agenda that we need to work on writing. So how do we do that? How do we balance, you know, like our needs and desires and our representation as well, or the chaotic moment that we use to educate others? To me, as Hadi, who used to train me, would always refer to it as a coming out moment. And, you know, like my colleagues who are collaborating with me, they always see it as a coming out moment, because it's as if, it's not like you're hiding something and you are bringing it up, but the situation creates, you know, like unraveling, you know, like what is hidden, and being able, or allowing yourself to talk about things that really centered on your core. But as you're talking about them, in the back of your head, you're always thinking about the confusion of others, about potential misunderstandings, and about other issues that make you feel sometimes you're not doing justice to who you are and your own identity. And this is why I feel it's always a coming out moment. Like, for example, with my mother, she doesn't need to entertain this coming out moment, because, you know, like her head cover shows that she practices Islam. But, you know, like she could be targeted in other ways in certain circles and certain contexts. But for me, you know, like I have to announce that I am Muslim. I have to defend that sometimes in my choices, in my practices, and my decisions.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maimuna.
Are there any other questions? Feel free to turn off your mic and ask a question, or enter a question into the chat.
And if you don't have questions, you can share your own experiences, because I've always wondered how you navigate these issues, even at institutions that might look uniform with respect to certain identity markers.
Yeah, I agree. I would love to hear those stories, Hadi, if someone else would, because my question is actually kind of about those spaces where kind of everybody is roughly the same identity, those homogenous spaces. So because I was wondering about like what the coming out experience is in those. I mean, and to what extent, you know, I'm thinking about how students often sometimes seek out peer tutors because they want someone who will identify with them, and what kinds of information should we maybe encourage or talk about with students to share at the beginning of a tutorial to help kind of create that common space? And to what extent is that a good thing, a positive thing, creating that common space? And to what extent might that erase any differences between the tutor and the student?
That's a very good question, because, like, I'm thinking of my context back in the United Arab Emirates, like if I, or even in the US, if I could identify that a student I'm working with, like, have some kind of common identity markers. Like, for example, I'm working with UMass Boston is a minority majority campus. So we work with a lot of refugee and immigrant students, and I represent that repertoire. So like, do I talk about these things at the beginning, even when I identify that that other student is multilingual or immigrant or refugee, or do I wait for that moment in their writing or as they are expressing themselves to empower them if I feel that they have any kind of, if they're feeling any kind of discomfort, and then come out about that status? Because as you know, in the US, like, some of our students are refugees but do not have, legal papers, and for them it's risky to come out as refugee students. So what do we do in these cases? And for example, the other day I was working with a student, and I could not identify that she was an immigrant student. She identified as Black. And then as we were talking, and she was expressing, like, why she's not comfortable and confident in writing and working on an assignment by herself, and this is why she seeks tutoring. I asked her about the reasons for that, and she then talked about, her immigration process to the US from Haiti, and like how, like, she was in ESL classes in intermediate school, and then like in high school she was done with ESL classes, but she still felt that it's hard to write in English, that it's hard to express herself in English when she compares to expressing herself and writing in French and Creole. And as she was talking, I could see from her demeanor and her facial expressions that she was struggling and not comfortable and not confident. So that was the moment for me to support her. That was a moment for me to kind of tell her that it's okay to be an immigrant. It's okay to be multilingual. It's okay to struggle with English. It's okay to learn new words. And that's when I told her, I'm also a refugee. I'm also an immigrant. I'm also multilingual. Even when I'm directing a program, I also learn new words every day. I sometimes struggle with writing. Even published authors struggle with writing. And I felt that after I shared with her that connection, she, like, her whole demeanor changed in the session, and she became more talkative. She poured herself more into the session, and she exercised more agency when she was working on her own writing. So for me, it's always important for the tutor to pay attention to the facial expressions, to pay attention to the body movements, to pay attention to the silence in sessions, and then think of what I can do, even if I don't align with that student in terms of my identity. What can I do to make them feel more comfortable and to give them that space to talk more and express themselves more? And it's a lot of emotional labor, and it's hectic sometimes for the tutor, but it's also the important work that we do in sessions.
Yes, thank you. I think you're reminding me of how much we're asking peer tutors to do, to both pay attention to that kind of surface level of the writing and working with the writer on the product in front of them, but then to have that sort of whole intellectual conversation that goes on underneath that writing, and to be paying close attention to that. That's definitely a challenge.
It is, and even for me, it is a challenge, because I'm thinking that student might come again to the writing center or might not, and they have a deadline and they need to work on their writing. So, like, what do I do? What decision do I make at that moment? And, like, the emotional labor of, am I serving the student Like sometimes when we're just working on the writing, we're serving the student just for that assignment. But sometimes, words of encouragement or thinking through, like what they're dealing with can serve them better in the long run.
Thank you so much. This has been really intellectually stimulating for me.
Thank you, Amy. And I left I think I uploaded the CFP in the chat, just for everyone to have access to it. And I hope, I was telling my collaborators, I'm so excited about this talk because I hope to see, contributions from the MENA region and the edited collection. Misty, go ahead. Hey, how are you?
Hi, I'm good. It's great to see you again.
Same here, same here.
Yeah, I really like everything you've been talking about, and I like especially I've latched onto the chaotic moment, right? And so you invite us to tell stories. So I'm going to tell a story that I'm not necessarily proud of, but so I've been teaching in Qatar for about 10 years now, and early on, a student was giving a presentation, and in class, they asked me, well, are you pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, right? And so I'm like, oh my, what do I do? What do I do, right? And so I remember, I thought on my feet pretty quickly. I go, because I didn't think that it was okay for me to say. I didn't think it was okay for me to say. So I said, well, I'm anti-bully. So you decide who you think is the bully in this situation, right? But I think—
Very smart.
Right. But I think the longer I've been here, the more I think it's okay to be pro-Palestinian in this on this campus, right? That's not necessarily a brave thing to do, right? It might be, and luckily those are my politics, right? So I feel like I don't have to hide that so much, but I don't necessarily wave it on a flag. So I don't know. But back to the religion thing too, I think sometimes as a tutor, because I've worked in the writing center too, and as a teacher, I tend to be whatever they need me to be. You know what I mean? Like, so if they want to talk about God, that's okay. And if they don't want to, that's okay. And so I wonder if I'm just a little bit, I don't want to say wishy-washy, but all things to all people. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I see what you're saying. And like I also go back in time to my work at University of Sharjah, and I taught at the American University of Sharjah as well. And I noticed that even within the same university city, like 5 minutes, a 5-minute drive apart, the context of students is very different. And what I could talk about in classrooms at the American University of Sharjah are things that I could not talk about at University of Sharjah. Yeah. So it's always like we're always evaluating the rhetorical situation we're in and how do we make this call. The question that you had asked, I find it very interesting because it's a question of positionality. Like the student is thinking of your own positionality and what you represent. And it's the same thing when I'm asked about my religious faith, because, like that student is also profiling you, Misty, according to a general rhetoric in the West about pro-Israel. But it doesn't mean that all people in the West are pro-Israel, because in Boston, for example, all the Palestinian demonstrations that I took part in, they had a lot of Westerners advocating for Palestinian rights. And it's the same thing when my South Korean friend asked me whether, like ISIS is connected to Islam. And to me was like, why is she even asking this question? She should not be asking this question. So what I started doing is asking them back why they're asking me the question, what they're thinking of, what is going on in their head, what is encouraging them to ask this question, for me to tap into the context they have, because a lot of the times this context is biased. This context is profiled. This context is not representative of the reality. And then I have a discussion on that context. I talk about that context. I use it as a chance to engage in that conversation and ask about their sources of information, where they've come across this information. And sometimes I give them alternative examples to show that, no, there are people who are pro-Palestine in the West. There are people who are against the anti-Muslim rhetoric in the US. And there are people who are not. And how do we deal with these things before I answer them back? So it's as if, you know, like I'm tossing the ball back just to have that context to see why they're profiling and what they're relying on to profile.
Right. That's such a great answer. Thank you so much. And I want to tell you one more little story incident from my first semester. We talk about interviewing, and then I put myself in front of them, and you can ask me, you know, questions, and I reserve the right not to answer. In that very first semester, a student said, "What did you think of Arabs before you came to Qatar? And what do you think of Arabs now?" Right?
And post, yeah.
Right. And I talked about how I was nervous to come here. And I talked about gender a lot, you know, and I was nervous about what to wear and could I go out jogging in a sleeveless shirt? And they're like, no, that's not what we're talking about. That's not what we're talking about, right? And so finally I said, well, what you're really asking about is stereotypes, right? And we all have them, but to admit them is it's vulnerable, right? To admit our stereotypes. And I said, but I'll tell you what, and we all have stereotypes. If you want to write about your stereotypes of Americans, and you want to write a piece about that, then I'll write about a piece about my stereotypes of Arabs, and you come to my office and we'll read our pieces to each other. And one student did it. One student did it. Yes.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a form of cultural exchange to, you know, like correct misconceptions, because we are engaging in these conversations all the time. We are correcting misconceptions all the time, and whether formally or informally. And it's sometimes uncomfortable to do that. And we don't like, I feel that we're always under the pressure because we're educators, we are the mentors, we are the role models, and we always have to have this perfect answer. But sometimes there's no perfect answer. And maybe our version of a perfect answer is not a perfect answer for that student. And maybe a student just wants to listen. Like with my student who came out about his sexuality, I was just sitting there and listening. And I think this is what he needed at that moment, and that's it. And I kind of, you know, like asked if he needs any form of support, and I even asked like why he decided to come out to me in particular. Well, that student, like I've taught for 2 semesters, then I started seeing in the writing center. So there was this level of familiarity, and students are smart and thinking about, you know, like the comfort level and who they can open up to and who they cannot open up to. But basically the student just like wanted to express himself, and he found that space. And I'm glad, you know, like it was, you know, like with me, not with another person, although maybe this other person would have also given that student, you know, like the space just to talk and express themselves.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much. We have probably just time for one final question or thought. If anyone has one, we're just at the end of the session now.
Ryan, I know we have 2 minutes, but I was wondering, when I first saw the call for papers and submissions, my mind went to something entirely different. But being someone who is very obviously Muslim as a result of the headscarf, and being in Saudi Arabia, you know, the home to Mecca and Medina, you know, and working in an all Saudi university, 100% almost Muslim, except for some of the faculty members that are expats. And I remember in several, not few sessions in the writing center where we had to dissuade our students from including religion in their essays. And so, for example, I mean, it's the opposite. For example, it's very common in Arabic instruction to start an essay by saying something like, I'll say it in Arabic and then translate, يحث الدين الإسلامي على, so the Islamic faith encourages so and so or whatever. And so students were so used to doing that they just started their English essays that way. They were supporting their ideas with verses from the Quran or stories from the Prophet's time. And we were trying to train them on how to be scientific and to like include concrete data and to like build a logical argument. Somehow thinking that should eliminate their faith. And that faith is something that you can't really prove, and it's something personal, and it's better to be kept out of the scientific argument instead of including it. So that's just the first thing that came up to mind when I was, and I just recalled a few of those sessions, and I'm wondering now that I hear Hadi talking, what you would think of that. I mean, there's no coming out here. There's more of a dissuasion of sorts of including faith in a situation where everybody shares the same faith.
I'm just in love with what you said, because I relate to this experience. That's what I did at University of Sharjah. Like when I was teaching English for academic purposes, we always, like across the board, please do, like when you're building the arguments, do not rely on religious faith, do not rely on verses from the Quran, do not rely on, like such kind of evidence, because we cannot argue against it. But now reflecting upon that, Maimuna, I think I was marginalizing students. I think I was not allowing them to bring that important rhetoric into writing. And I was doing them disservice. And I started to realize these things when I did my PhD in the US, and started thinking about building arguments and writing studies, and how when we build arguments, we appeal to ethos, pathos, and logos. And this knowledge, like I didn't have this knowledge back then, because, like I did my master's in applied linguistics at the American University of Beirut, and then, like went on and started teaching. But now if in the future, like I find myself working in the MENA region, I would definitely invite students to make these appeals to their arguments, because it's not only representing their faith, it's representing knowledge they have, it's representing knowledge they believe in, and it's also honoring translingual writing. Because translingual writing is not, about code meshing and mixing languages only in an essay, but it's how we allow students to use the rhetorical processes in their first language and invite them into their second or additional language. So as you mentioned, in Arabic, we do rely on Quranic verses when we are writing, and it gives a lot of support and it adds beauty to the writing. So if a student is transferring that rhetorical process from their first language, from writing in Arabic into writing in a second language, we should embrace it and we should welcome it. But I did the same, Maimuna. I used to do the same. I used to, like marginalize them. But my experiences later on made me realize that, that was wrong. But the issue also about the MENA region is that there should be agreement across the board. There should be agreement through our professional development, through training, because if one person is doing it and the other is not doing it, then it becomes, as well a sensitive topic, or, like a tricky topic. But really, Maimuna, if you send like what you're talking about really aligns with what we are hoping to see in this edited collection. I hope to see a proposal from you about these experiences, because, like we're not looking for research-oriented chapters only. We're looking for these narratives. We're looking for these experiences we're looking for these thoughts, we're looking for these autoethnographies, for these narratives, and we expect that most of the edited collection would focus on such chapters. So you don't really have to have, like recorded sessions and transcripts and you're analyzing them. Your experiences matter, and bringing them into this part of the world would be welcomed.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Hadi. Thank you to all of the participants who are here today. It's great to see everyone back. And we hope to see you at some future discussions, everyone. And hopefully we'll have some contributions from the MENA region to the book chapters as Hadi's asking for. It'd be great to read. I'm personally really excited about the book coming out. And I'm looking forward to reading it in the future. But thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your thoughts, and I think given us a lot to think about. I'm certainly much better informed and more curious than I was an hour ago. So I really appreciate you coming on to join us.
Thank you so much, Ryan, and thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it, and I'm always excited to be in touch with my fellow practitioners and scholars in the MENA region. I miss the Middle East almost every day, so I'm happy to be here and to spend my morning with you.
Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a wonderful evening.
Yeah, you as well. To everyone, have a wonderful evening. Thank you so much, and we'll see everyone soon.